Hi everyone! My name is Olivia Gorczyca. I am a fellow with the Center for Academic Innovation on the Online and Hybrid Programs team. This is my student showcase presentation on process mapping student services for DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's get into our introduction. This presentation asks, how can we design student services for online and hybrid programs that inform diversity, equity, and inclusion? So to answer this question, we're going to investigate what research says, how current frameworks support diversity, equity, and inclusion, online services in the modern day, process mapping student services frameworks, and then we're going to come to a nice conclusion. So first, let's start with what the research says on student services. The insights from the research used for this project include the collection of student-facing data, what we know about the use of differentiated services, implications for institutions, and an exploration of what frameworks currently exist. So let's get into the collection of student-facing data. The research used for this presentation shows that both collection of student-facing data and the data collection instruments are crucial for informing student services networks. In many of the studies used, surveys were the primary tool for data collection. Research tells us that surveys are a crucial instrument for collecting student-facing data, and using effective surveys can gather reliable information from large groups. Research also tells us that surveys should be piloted and refined before being distributed. This can help improve completion rates and collect the right kind of information. To collect student-facing data, this is one of the most powerful tools an institution can use. In addition to surveys, interviews were also used to collect data, and the studies consulted included protocols for interviews and verbatim copies and outlines of the questions used. You can also see here that I've noted the importance of having a balance between qualitative and quantitative data sources. Quantitative data provides numbers to inform decision-making and future research endeavors, while qualitative data helps us understand the individual's experience. Now let's move on to planning for diverse populations. The differentiation of services for diverse populations is really important when considering the diversity that exists within any student body you may be serving. Let's start with online and residential students. The differences between online and residential students are significant, and this impacts the delivery of services to both groups. Research shows that online and residential students prioritize different services. For example, online students prioritize academic advising, admissions, financial aid, and library services. Advising, admissions, and financial aid are very important for online and distance learners who have to connect with offices online or over the phone to perform these crucial onboarding processes. Lack of in-person access also informs the prioritization of library services by online students. Let's take a look at the difference between graduate and undergraduate students. Like online and residential students have different needs, so do undergraduate and graduate level students. Research shows that graduate and doctoral students, like online students, significantly prioritize library services. Graduate and doctoral students require access to research databases to complete their degree work, and librarian assistance is crucial to navigating digital library systems. Research also indicates that despite their differentiated need for services, graduate students are less likely than undergraduate students to take advantage of these services. Let's move on to looking at some cultural considerations. Several studies have examined the relationships between identity and the provision of student services. One of the most important conclusive points is that cultural norms and personal identity are related to help-seeking behavior and willingness to engage with student services providers. Research finds that cultural norms and cultural and personal identity need to be taken into consideration when constructing frameworks. The provision and differentiation of services and selecting student service personnel are also very important parts of this process. These studies also highlighted the need to look forward and consider how cultural differences that can cause conflict in a residential context can be even further exacerbated in the online space, and what that means for the design and provision of our student services. We also have to consider common barriers to access. Research has investigated the barriers to access that exist for various groups of students. But for both online and residential students, some common barriers exist. For example, not knowing what services are offered, a lack of confidence in the effectiveness of these services, fear of stigma, or needing services that fall outside of the normal business hours. This is especially pertinent for online and distance students who might reside in a time zone or a geographical location that makes access quite difficult. Our last point on differentiation is the digitization of student services. One important aspect of differentiation is the option to access student services online or in person. While some services can easily make the transition to the digital space and be automated to free up service providers, the digitization of others generates concern. For example, while career counseling and academic counseling can be provided online, personal counseling or therapy is subject to several legal and logistical limitations. It is also important to note that while the digitization of services can make access easier, it does not totally mitigate issues of access and equity. Asynchronous services such as message portals or self-assessments can be available 24/7, but the opportunity to connect with a real person is often limited to just the windows of an institution's hours of operation. Now, these are just some of the many differentiation and framing strategies for implementing online and hybrid student services. As part of your process mapping process, you should be thinking about how to differentiate services for the vast array of people that you're going to be serving. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but rather it's drawn from an extensive literature review and can help us understand student priorities and designing for optimal service engagement. Now, let's move on to some institutional implications. From the research analyzed, it became clear that one of the most important factors in successful student services delivery is the institution and its actors. This includes the student services staff, professors and teaching faculty, and the institution itself. So let's start with student services staff. The importance of student services staff can be tied back to the part of the presentation we just left off on, where we discussed the importance of identity and shared understandings and context between student services providers and student services recipients. A student services staff which is perceived as effective by students and proficient in the context of their population is likely also a staff with diverse representation, experiences, and capabilities, including staff with both residential and online learning experiences. In this sense, an institution would likely be motivated to build a student services team that is representative of their student body and the collective institutional context to create a better perception of effectiveness for students. We also have to consider the faculty role in student services delivery. Research has shown that faculty have a significant role in the provision and maintenance of student services. Teaching faculty are often the first to recognize signs that students need help, but research also indicates that lack of training, lack of knowledge on services, or a potential bias against hand-holding or guidance at the university level can prevent students from accessing services they need through a faculty member. When professors and teaching faculty see referrals to student services as an integral part of their position, students may be more likely to find the appropriate services and providers to fit their needs. Now, just as student services staff and faculty are implicated in the student services process, institutions are one of the most important actors in the development and provision of student services. Institutions have a responsibility to assess current student services models and collect student-facing data to inform their ever-evolving frameworks. Institutions also have a responsibility to employ faculty and service providers that reflect student demographics and the local context. Now that we've touched on institutional implications for student services, let's move on to some examples of the current framework. The research supporting this presentation naturally included examples of frameworks and exemplars, and some of them are represented here. So first we're going to look at the Inclusive Student Services Process Model. Published in a 2004 study on distance learning and student services, this model is designed with 5 stages. You can see it starts with the learner intake phase and it ends with the measurement phase. Within each of the categories, crucial student services and processes are outlined. For example, in the learning phase, online or onboarding steps such as admissions, financial aid, goal setting, and career planning are addressed. During the learner intervention and support phase, services such as faculty advising, academic advising, tutoring, and library services are prioritized. This framework helps identify key areas of assistance for students in a chronological or linear order, and how engagement with student services and student needs can change over the course of a semester or a program. Based on the research, here are some ways to conceptualize models when thinking about delivering hybrid student services. There are several models of conception, design, and objectives that will always influence the final product. For example, several existing residential services programs have attempted to build online frameworks by adding new online services to existing residential facilities. Another option is that some hybrid frameworks can be constructed when a new residential student services framework is being built. This allows for expanded consideration of both online, distance, and residential learner needs. Building from these first two models will always continue to center the foundational and residential experience and the needs of that demographic, which can hinder distance learners and make for incomplete access to services. A third conceptualization is designing purely for hybrid spaces. This requires the framework builders to stray from the residential model and focus on the multifaceted needs of both groups, which is not an easy task. By designing a truly hybrid framework, student services can create an opportunity space to reach larger numbers of learners and address barriers to service access. So with all this in mind, let's look at a couple exemplar case studies. So during the review of the literature used in this presentation, there were obviously several exemplars in the provision of student services, but for the sake of brevity, I've chosen just two: Lone Star Community College and Rio Salado Community College. Lone Star Community College is based out of Houston, Texas, and is noted as an exemplar for online student services. An overview of Lone Star's student services framework reveals three overarching categories in their provision process: personalized digital services, the mediums utilized by the college, and its equity and access dedication. One of Lone Star's digital services is the Early Alert Assistance, which sends students notifications if they haven't logged into the student portal for a number of days. This alert can be programmed to go off at specific intervals. Lone Star also offers online academic and career advising, which includes access to a case manager assigned to your individual file, which brings an extreme level of personalization to the digital space that is not common. Case managers pay particular attention to what they call FTIC, or First Time in College students. Individualized attention for these students is important, as their knowledge on student services and how to navigate the bureaucracy of university is severely limited. This is especially important for first-generation college students, who don't have the privilege of parents, siblings, or other mentors or guiders as they phase into college. Lone Star also utilizes several digital mediums to provide services to students, both synchronously and asynchronously. For example, Lone Star offers 24/7 technical support for students. Online advising is conducted from remote locations using special software programs, and e-newsletters are sent to students and tracked for clicks, traffic to areas of interest or need, and the rates of read newsletters. This generates quantitative data that can be used in future iterations of collecting student-facing data, just like we've been talking about. Lastly, Lone Star's online services are uniquely geared towards equity and access. For example, orientation for returning and new students can be conducted entirely online. Students are able to self-assess their capacity for taking online classes using a tool through the university site, and tutoring is offered remotely. This is really important for equity and access because assessments, orientation, and tutoring, all important processes to success in a university setting, are generally conducted in person. The digitization of these core services allow expanded access and equity between residential and online learners. So now let's look at our second exemplar. Rio Salado Community College is based in Tempe, Arizona, and is an exemplar in online student services in the provision of equity, diversity, and inclusion through its support networks. For example, Rio Salado offers the Es Puente program for at-risk local high school youth to earn low-cost college credits, and they pay particular attention to those who are first-generation college students, teen parents, or students living in foster care. The Es Puente program is an excellent example of how student services can be informed by equity measures. The study outlining the inclusive student services model notes that Rio Salado is an exemplar in the learner support phase, which is characterized by a focus on academic advising, library services, networking, instructional support, and tutoring. Rio Salado excels in these services by offering digital access through student portals, apps, and dedicated social media pages for current students to connect. So now that we've reviewed everything that the research has to say, let's move on to the second and equally important question in this presentation, which is, how do student frameworks support DE&I initiatives? Or conversely, how does diversity, equity, and inclusion inform the creation of student services frameworks? A really important consideration is equitable digital experiences. One of the most pressing equity concerns when providing student services, specifically for online and distance learners, is digital equity. How will learners be oriented and equipped to navigate online student services networks? What about students with sparse or weak internet access, limited digital literacy, lack of access to a personal computer, or other barriers to accessing crucial services? It's also important to think about designing for accessibility. Designing for accessibility can help mitigate any barriers to access that students may experience. This includes designing in-person and online facilities for accessibility, expanding business hours, and including 24/7 digital options, as well as designing for those of various language proficiency levels and disability status, among others. It's also important to note that designing online services for accessibility can help residential students who might have barriers to accessing these services in their traditional and foundational format. It's also important to utilize feedback. Research suggests that student and faculty feedback is crucial to develop ever-improving iterations of student service networks. Addressing student and faculty suggestions and concerns is not only inclusive, but equitable as well, because it allows for multiple perspectives and experiences to be considered in future services design. Now, this feedback can be collected quantitatively or qualitatively, as we discussed earlier in the presentation. It's also important to consider diverse staff. Research indicates that for many students seeking services, especially deeply personal services such as counseling, the identity of the student services provider is a really important factor. A sense of shared identity can improve a student's confidence in the effectiveness of the service and make a student feel more at ease, which allows the student services professional to fully engage with the student's issues. Our last point on considerations to make is community connections. One major difference between universities and community college is the effort on behalf of community colleges to connect with their community and offer services not only for current students, but for prospective ones as well. And that's evident in the Rio Salado Services Network. Community colleges play a particularly important role in diversity, equity, and inclusion by maintaining connections with the community and community stakeholders while providing services to promote agency and advancement in its local population. So now that we've addressed some of our concerns related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's dive into how student services can be analyzed in light of recent events. This part of the presentation had not initially been planned, but the shift to online delivery in response to the novel coronavirus outbreak occurred as this presentation was being created. As the University of Michigan shifted to online and remote learning, considerations for student services shifted as a result. For this part of the presentation, I talked with the Student Services Program Manager for the School of Public Health here at the University of Michigan, who provided insights about how the reframing of student services is playing out in this time of emergency response. I asked them about trends they had noticed in the shift to remote delivery, what other academic units have been experiencing, and how this aligns with their knowledge as a professor of fully online students. Here you can see some of the questions that influenced my thinking going into this interview, and outlined later I have several emerging themes from our discussion. So one of the main themes that came up was managing interpersonal responsibility. Without the option to conduct office hours or advising in person, many professors have struggled to adapt these crucial interpersonal interactions to the digital space. This overlaps with digital literacy and proficiency, such as knowing how to set your available hours on digital connection spaces and to ensure the modes of communication are secure. With the jump to remote and online learning, faculty have been bombarded with the array of digital means used to deliver classes. Faculty are expected to toggle between various different programs including BlueJeans, Zoom, Google Hangouts, Slack, Canvas, and other platforms used to deliver instruction. Faculty also need digital proficiency to make use of all these platforms effectively. For example, some professors may be overwhelmed and receiving Slack notifications 24/7 only because they don't know how to limit their available hours in the notification preferences. Another question that came up is what can and should be moved online. It is important to note that not every service can be moved online, such as personal mental health counseling, and some services cannot be moved online effectively. It's important to think critically on the overlap of what students need and what spaces exist to move those services online in an effective way. Another question is confidentiality. Are we using software and programs that are secure and FERPA compliant? Another consideration is the emergency state. As a closing note on the notes of this conversation, one of the most important takeaways is that the provision of classes and services online does not constitute remote teaching or a complete online student services system. This is a temporary setup in reaction to a global pandemic. However, the experiences of faculty and service providers are invaluable pieces of qualitative data as we explore how online and residential students can be coexist. However, the experiences of faculty and service providers are invaluable pieces of qualitative data as we explore how online and residential student services programs can be co-designed to coexist. So now let's move on to process mapping a student services network. At this point in the presentation, we reviewed types of student services frameworks, the benefits and drawbacks of each, unique exemplars and barriers to access, and the institution's role in student services provision. At this point in the presentation, we've reviewed types of student services frameworks, benefits and drawbacks of each, unique exemplars, barriers to access, and the institution's role in student services provision. How can this information be used to process map student services networks? Why is it important that we ask these questions on diversity, inclusion, access, and equity? Let's first look into the lessons from our exemplars. Given the cases that we've discussed, what are lessons we can take from the framing of their systems and the methods they employ? Both the exemplars use a blend of synchronous and asynchronous methods to provide services and expand access. This includes automating services when possible, like Lone Star's early alert assistance. These exemplars also show how real frameworks, like the Inclusive Student Services Framework, can be applied at the institutional level. Not only are these frameworks functional enough to be applied at the institutional level, but in the case of Rio Salado, they are functional enough to make an institution an exemplar. Another strength of the exemplar cases is their digital literacy and information technology support systems. While these programs have great online and digital services for distance learners, the services are useless if students cannot access them. Assessing and building digital competencies through IT help desks and digital orientation services allows for equitable access to well-designed online services. A final lesson from these exemplars is utilizing feedback. Utilizing feedback from students is one of the most important data sources for improving student services and addressing DE&I concerns. Now, as we've mentioned earlier in the presentation, qualitative and quantitative data are both extremely helpful for collecting feedback and assessing future iterations. Let's also look into some design questions. Based on the models and frameworks discussed in this presentation, there are a handful of questions here to guide our systems thinking around process mapping. It's important to ask what framework is being used as the foundation for this system. Is it an existing residential system with online add-ons, or is it a truly hybrid framework? The framework being used will also influence whose needs are being prioritized and centered in this system. It's also important to ask what services different groups of students need, and how those services are broken up chronologically, logistically, or in a linear order, and how student engagement with services changes over time. Another important question to ask is how innovation and improvement measures are built in. It's important to be able to collect and utilize feedback, both qualitative and quantitative data, to have successful future iterations. It's also important to ask that if baseline or otherwise prioritized services are delivered in a better way, how will students expand or change their interaction with student services? Let's also look at some of the key players when process mapping student services networks. Staff, administration, and faculty are all important to create a student services network, as they're the individuals who will carry out the work itself. For student services staff, it's important to have an interconnected and well-trained system made up of diverse identities and experiences. Faculty need training to understand what services are available to students, and some faculty may need training to eliminate bias against student services and see referral to these services as part of their role as a university member. So now let's look into some of the implications that stemmed from our conversation around the provision of student services and the impacts of a global pandemic. How does this knowledge help us process map for student services? One of the most important themes is communication. This means making communication clear and explicit, including noting who the communication is intended for, whether graduate or undergraduate, online or residential. Especially when communications are coming from higher up, coming from an administrative level, this is really important to kind of diffuse confusion among students that are already spread out and ill-connected. It's also important to determine students' needs. This goes along with determining what students need and how those services can be provided in accessible ways, and that does not always mean through online spaces. It's also important to consider faculty training. Faculty training is important so that they can use the array of online tools available and that they can be aware of the services available to students. It's also important to curate the resources and platforms available to both faculty and students. When they have access to a vast array of platforms and tools, this can become cluttered and overwhelming and confusing. It's important to keep these platforms and resources organized and streamlined. Of course, these are just some of the implications of our current state. This is in no way an exhaustive list, but it can help us think about how frameworks and process maps translate into crisis mode. And it's important to note here that the online availability, it does not equal a complete services framework. Like I said, we are in crisis mode, and we are developing services to reflect the needs of our students in the time of a pandemic. Now let's move on to our conclusion. And we're going to revisit our central question. How can we design student services for online and hybrid programs that inform diversity, equity, and inclusion? While this presentation used research as the primary source of information, this is not meant as a research project. Rather, it's a substantive resource meant to ask questions of student services design and the design of those services to inform diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the key takeaway points for this presentation are, first off, the process mapping end of it. How research and student-facing data inform our current frameworks and our explorations of future iterations. It's important to consult research and to consult student-facing data about what students need and what an institution can provide. It's also important to know your audience, the audience being the student body being served by this framework or model. This factors into the training of personnel and the identities reflected on any administrative or student services providing team. The last major point here is that there is no ideal student services network. From world-class universities to small-scale community colleges, each institution operates within a unique context and serves distinct groups of students. Thinking about frameworks, whose needs are centered, issues of equity and inclusion, and how research can be applied to the construction of hybrid models are all equally important considerations when designing student services to inform diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd like to thank everyone very much for your time. I hope this presentation has pushed you to reflect on your own experiences and systems and how you can transform those systems to inform efforts on the behalf of diversity, equity, and inclusion.